Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. Welcome to today's conversation. My name is Jen Stojkovic. I am the Executive Director of SF City. I see everybody is electronically filing in right now. For those of you that join any of our other SF City conversations, you know this is the point where I say, everybody, take your virtual seat. A little bit of a fun situation a year into the pandemic, doing these virtual events and trying to pretend like I'm looking at an audience. And so with that being said, we've got a really, really jam-packed day for you. We have amazing speakers coming from all different industries. We're going to be talking about the changing future of remote work, what is going on in the tech industry. We have speakers coming from venture capital. We have CEOs, we have mayors, we have thought leaders that are working in real estate, working from different job sites as well, to talk about what is going on with the tech industry and what is the future of tech going to look like. So I am going to quickly do some housekeeping notes because I know everybody that's joining today would love to get straight to the conversation. First things first, we will be doing a Q&A today. So the Q&A will specifically be after the panel conversation. So if you have any questions throughout the panel conversation, please drop them down in the Q&A tab. I think most of you, after a year of this, should be Zoom aficionados. So I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with it. But if you are not familiar with Zoom, you will see that Q&A button at the far right on the bottom of the screen. We will have Liza that will be joining shortly in a moment from the Washington Post that will be moderating, and she will get to as many questions as possible and bring them to our panelists. So please, throughout the talk, throw your questions into the Q&A tab. Next, the big question that everybody asks, are these live events going to be recorded? I want to rewatch and nerd out on every single fact that's being shared. Good news for you. Of course, it's being recorded. All SF City events are always recorded, so you can rewatch and share with everybody until your heart's content. Lastly, on social media, we will be sharing throughout today's conversation. We've got a lot of conversations for you today. You'll see in the chat that we just shared, our hashtag for today is #TechMigration, and you can tag at SFCITI at SF City on Twitter to share your thoughts. We would love to hear what you think about today's conversation with our first panel of leaders, as well as some of the other conversations we'll be having a little bit later today. All right, I think that about does it for the housekeeping. We're a few minutes after the hour, so let's get straight to it. Liza Dwoskin from the Washington Post, please come on up on stage. Welcome. How's it going?
Hey, good. How are you?
I mean, I am all ready for the conversation. We got a lot of people filing in. I think a lot of people want to hear what is going on, all things tech, Silicon Valley, outside of the Valley. You're going to have a captive audience, I think.
Nice. Well, I'm really excited. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited for the conversation, mostly because I love talking to smart people about interesting things. And I feel like this year we've seen the pandemic has really just ushered in these macroeconomic changes in the labor market that are affecting our home and across the country. And we're just beginning to understand what's been happening right before our eyes and beneath our feet. And so I love talking to interesting people who are on the ground with some of the changes. So yeah, I'll jump in and introduce everyone if
amazing. All right, I'm gonna hand the virtual mic over to you. I'm gonna pop off screen, and Liza, you may take it away.
Cool. So first, I'd like to introduce Mai Cutler. I'll start with Mai because I know her the best, and in her from her former life as a journalist. Kim is a partner at Initialized Capital, an early stage venture firm, and before that, she was a journalist for more than a decade. Other fun fact is Kim and I think, had our babies at the very same week. Then I'll introduce Justin Bedekare. He's the CEO of Raise, which is a modern commercial real estate brokerage on a mission to help everyone find a workplace that they love. And we'll hear more about that. And finally, we have Guy Berger. He is principal economist at LinkedIn. He studies LinkedIn's economic graph, its web of relationships, to understand the dynamics of the labor market. And prior to that, he worked as an economist at Bank of America and Royal Bank of Scotland. So thanks everyone for being here. And I will just jump in with a question. Guy, my first question is actually for you. So I really want to just start out with asking you to give us the big picture. Okay, we've seen massive changes happening in the country, in the labor market. Who is coming? Who is leaving? Are they affluent? What jobs do they have? Are they poor? What does the big picture look like?
That's a great question. So to start with, I think that there's definitely been a change here in the Bay Area. I think when we look at our data in big metro areas, the two places that have been hit the hardest in terms of, let's call it the terms of trade of people coming and going, deteriorating the most. The New York City metro area and the SF Bay Area are the biggest ones. The Bay Area, though, is interesting. And I think contrary to, a lot of the stylized conversation about, everybody's leaving, when we look at our data, the Bay Area doesn't look particularly unusual in terms of more people than usual leaving relative to other major metro areas. What's really changed in the past years are the number of people coming in has massively declined. And I think, what differentiates potentially the Bay Area relative to other metro areas, this is a very, I'd almost call it transient. People come here for a little while, then they leave. There's some people obviously that settle, but I think because of potentially of high real estate costs, there's just this enormous amount of churn, and just one side of that flow has really declined. The other thing that's really noticeable is this deterioration has happened relative to almost every other metro area, and it's particularly accentuated for tech workers. Places that used to ship a lot of tech workers to the Bay Area, like Chicago and Philly, the flow from those places declined a lot. It certainly declined a lot from London, partially because I think it's a lot harder to travel international borders. And it's also, happened even in places that were already like attracting a lot of talent from the Bay Area, tech talent from the Bay Area, like Austin. The Bay Area, if anything, is, there's more of a net outflow to Austin now than there was a year ago. So the Bay Area really has been hit by the fact that people seem actually, ironically, less, not just leaving, but really less inclined to come here than they were in the past.
That's interesting. So actually the bigger story is less inflow, even though we talk a lot more about all the outflow, everyone going to Austin and Miami, et cetera. But you're seeing less inflow is what you're saying.
Definitely. Whether it's college graduates or experienced workers, fewer of them are coming here and that's not nearly as extreme in other places where that have experienced the same deterioration.
I want to bring Kim Mai and Justin into the conversation to see what they're seeing, but it does raise the question of, can we gauge the intent of all those that are not inflowing now, whether they will have intent to come after the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in. Just at our company, we have, several folks that are planning to come when, the world opens back up. It's been really tight and locked down for a while. And so the benefit of, a place like San Francisco, where, the food and the people and the serendipity, you just haven't been able to experience that in a year. My view is that the Bay Area is so unique in just its high density of talent, capital, top universities. The network effects are so strong in the Bay Area. So, despite many things working against it, those are really, really hard to break.
Kim Mai, what do you think?
You're on mute, Kim.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Well, I mean, I would say that even before the pandemic, we were seeing some of the behavior that Guy is describing already happening simply because of the cost of living. And so there was definitely concern, at least on my part as someone who's grown up here, that it was just getting too expensive for, a younger generation of talent to come in and kind of, give the region a different kind of creative spark, which is what we see generally every decade. But then, one positive aspect to what has happened, which is not to say everything that's happened is, it's been devastating and tragic, is that, rents have come down so much that there is really an opportunity for, if you're starting out your career in 2021, or you're in the early phase of your career, there are rents and prices to be had here that we just were not possible 18 months ago. And that, ideally refreshes a lot of the talent, ideas, culture that's here.
Right. That's a really good point, that right now rent is, I'm not going to say cheap because this is the Bay
Not
Area.
cheap.
By
It's
any
still
means.
Still literally the most expensive city
still-
in the country, despite its, drop in prices.
Yeah,
But,
despite a 20% drop in prices.
like a lot of people I know who, wanted to, upgrade to a different apartment, got the chance to do so if they wanted to upgrade to a different rent controlled apartment. And then obviously like this year, if you want to come in, the time is really now.
So are you, as the lifetime Bay Area, Mai, are you inviting people to come in? Do you like the trend? I would say, how do you feel about the trend of people leaving versus would you rather see people return to the Bay Area in a more, and keep that vibrancy? Do you think it's losing its vibrancy?
It's bittersweet. Yeah. I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of friends who want to have kids or want to raise a family. And, the math is very foreboding here, I would say, between the cost of housing and childcare. So obviously there's some element of that is sad to see a lot of people that I've known over the last 10 years, choose to go to other places for completely understandable reasons. And yet at the same time, it's, part of the life and cycle of a city in a metropolitan region to have, different groups of people come in and come out. And, they're for a lot of people who it's a complicated answer, but for a lot of people who were feeling a lot of stress before, some people have gotten to, find new homes in San Francisco, rent controlled homes, like at a much better price than they would have been able to find like 2 years ago. And then at the same time, like there will be new people who come in their early to mid 20s, and they'll have different ways of seeing the world. And, it'll be like what happened, post-recession in different cycles where, just
how many of the companies that you work with have decided to make remote work a permanent?
Yeah, I mean, we actually released data on this 2 or 3 months ago, or was it, no, maybe 1 or 2 months ago. I've been running a survey of our portfolio every year for the last several years, and it's always been a question in the survey, just because it's always been a curiosity of mine, like what percentage of companies are remote versus having a centralized office. And, for the last 7 years in general, I mean, Initialized has generally seen our share of Bay Area based companies go down over time because of this cost issue that I talked about. And then also like it's just on a relative basis, easier to found and run a company from other places than it used to be. But, pre-pandemic, we were noticing that, around 17 to 18% of founders were telling us that they were 100% decentralized. And then that doubled to about 36% as of early this year. So it'll be interesting to see where teams and founders settle after the pandemic.
So the answer is 36% now, but have they told you how many intend to make it permanent? Or
that was the intent. What I think, let me go back to the question. The question was, it was what percentage of once the pandemic is over, what office model will your team choose? And 36.1% of founders said fully decentralized.
Okay. Which actually segues interestingly to the office space type of questions. So before I go there, I will point out that Kim Mai's talking about rent prices going down, but home prices are still going up.
Yep.
So that people wanting to settle is even still more cost prohibitive in the Bay than it was before. Let's talk a little bit about office space. Last year I did a big story about Twitter in the Post, and Twitter was the first major company to announce that they would go fully remote. In fact, they'd been doing it quietly for 2 years prior, which not many people know. They just hadn't, screamed it from the hilltops. But it was really interesting to tour this massive office. It was just me and one other person, completely empty. And if you've all been to those buzzy tech offices with the latte bars and the big lunch cafeterias, it was completely empty. And I'm looking at it standing outside and thinking, even though Twitter's telling me that they're not planning to give up any office space, it seems impossible. And I'm looking at this empty block, this quiet block in this quiet office and thinking, is this the future of San Francisco? Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, to be clear, Twitter is not going fully remote, right? They're going remote first, which means that like their employees are going to have an option of whether or not they come into the office. And frankly, even at these bigger companies, most people are going to be connected to an office, right? Like, despite the headlines, we're seeing the reality on the ground that so many of our clients want to get back. Like, Salesforce was, a big newsmaker recently about their dramatic shift of work, right? Where most of their employees are going to be in the office, up to 3 days a week, but 80% still want to be connected to an office in some form or fashion. Our demand compared to Q1 of 2020, which was like the last quarter pre-pandemic, we see greater demand right now, and some of that is just like a rebound from a lot of companies like bringing back requirements that they held on for a year. But my prediction is that within 2 years, we're at 80 to 90% of the capacity pre-pandemic. It will look very different. But in 2022, when you go and visit that same office, it's going to be alive with a lot of energy, a lot of people excited to be together. It's just that like a lot more people are going to have the option to. So I think that like in the last year is not representative of the future, but it has caused a really big shift.
So, okay, in 2 years, it'll be still a lot of people, but fewer is, I think, the point you're making. But then what about, I mean, do you think it'll be like, instead of the one big office, Twitter HQ, you'll see just a lot of smaller offices dotted around, or just fewer offices at all?
Yeah, I think that it'll actually be more offices in total, right? Like even one of our clients, Mercury, that less than 100 people. The CEO was just sharing stats publicly, but they're going to be setting up at least 3 or 4 offices around North America, and at that size, that is a big shift in terms of being like headquarter centric. I think that like the actual offices are going to be much more dynamic and like fulfill the kind of dynamic work style that like people are going to be accustomed to over the next couple of years. But it's going to be really hard, right? Like hybrid, and by hybrid I mean whether it's a combination of office centricity and remote, or people coming in 3 days a week, not 5 days a week. You're going to have to design the offices to accommodate that. So it's, you're not going to see those, row after row of, individual desking that takes up most of the office. Most of the office is going to be collaborative spaces to connect the people in the office and the outside world, right? And so there's going to be more hybrid meetings, more communal space, more conference rooms, and less kind of designated heads down space, but like that space will actually be designed for people to focus. And
more
so
hot desks.
Yeah,
It's all hot desks. Guy, I see you really wanting to jump in with a couple things.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I'm not an expert in remote versus hybrid work. I'm certainly working remotely. I imagine I'll be working hybrid, whereas before I used to be in the office every day. But who knows what it's going to look like in 5 years. I do think it's interesting because it opens up all sorts of possibilities in the way economic geography is organized that we haven't thought of before. For example, people are talking, I think somewhat prematurely about how this is really going to, shrink the biggest metro areas. For all we know, hybrid work actually makes people more tolerant of longer commutes because they're only coming into to work 2 or 3 days a week instead of 5. They might be even willing to live further away. For all we know, that the economic and geographic footprint of the San Francisco Bay Area is going to stretch to some degree. It's already been stretching to places like the Sacramento metro area, to Stockton, in a way that right now is just probably really painful to travel 5 days a week, but a few days a week might be feasible. I think it's for all I know, maybe some of these commercial spaces, if it does end up being less demand for office space, which I'm not sure about, but we have to consider as a possibility. Maybe that gets converted into more residential space. That cities become even less of a place to work and more a place to live, or to essentially consume amenities. I think that some of the really pessimistic forecasts for a place like the Bay Area, to me, are, because of this pandemic, just seem really, really overdone.
What is the most pessimistic forecast being? What, empty downtowns, San Francisco no longer
Yeah,
a tech hub.
literally the death of San Francisco, right?
Yeah, like not that I want to be too pessimistic, but like, and again, I don't want this is a revival, but like almost like San Francisco is the next Rust Belt city, I think is sort of the like a really pessimistic type interpretation that I've heard thrown around.
Yeah, I take the view of Kim Mai's partner, Gary Tan, that this next decade is going to be a renaissance in San Francisco. Pre-pandemic, like the idea of going back to normal, the end of 2019 was not normal by any stretch of the imagination. It was insane. We had low single-digit vacancy in office space. Housing, artificially, kind of risen up through just the lack of building, but it was not sustainable. And so, I would have never chosen to go through the pandemic to like reach a new equilibrium, but there is going to be more access to the city. More startups are going to be co-located together, in major cities and, able to afford, really great space that like draws their team together. And so we don't want to go back to the pre-pandemic level. It just wasn't sustainable. And, the next decade, I think, is going to, I'm very optimistic about, like I said, the Renaissance coming back to San Francisco.
Well, I think what everyone wants or dreams, what everyone wants is sort of this idea that the city of innovation that's also affordable. Like, what were the conditions that when San Francisco was at its peak innovation, wherever, I'd love for each of you to hear what year you put that at, but whenever San Francisco reached peak innovation, before it got too expensive, before people started leaving, what were the conditions that created that? Can those conditions maintain? And can you create those conditions in other cities? Like, I wonder to myself, do you need to have places that are such a big physical hub of one industry anymore to create those kind of innovative ideas that Silicon Valley? Kim Mai, what do you think?
I think this like nostalgic impression of the city as a more affordable place, you have to remember the federal context in which that existed, which is that we had federal housing policy that was intentionally racially discriminatory on a lending basis and, intentionally encouraged, white middle-class families to leave American cities, move out to the suburbs, and then didn't functionally allow access to lending or mortgage capital for neighborhoods that were diverse in the cities. And so like, it's a complex situation. It's like, would anybody say we should go back to that like set of federal policies that made city real estate, artificially lower than it, was today? I don't think that anyone would say that. At the same time, if you wanted to go to a place where, landowners were not getting like a disproportionate share of, financial returns on just sitting on land, you would have to really fundamentally restructure the way this country looks at real estate property, which doesn't seem like something that's going to happen immediately or anytime in the near future. Cities are expensive because they are, places of agglomeration where people, get creative or innovative or entrepreneurial ideas off of each other. And then that gets disproportionately priced into land values as a result of the kind of property ownership structure we have in this country. So, yeah.
What do you think? Oh, go on.
I think that the other aspect of San Francisco specifically is that it hasn't always been the center of Silicon Valley. That is a relatively new phenomenon over the last decade.
20 years, the last 20 years, but yeah.
Yeah,
I would less, because people are talking about Uber, setting up its offices in San Francisco. That was a big deal when Uber did that, as opposed to locating its offices in the Valley.
Yeah, the first ones were, well, in my mind, I think that like the most change in San Francisco has been since the Great Recession, where Twitter and Salesforce and Zynga both all committed to San Francisco. The pattern was always start small in San Francisco and then scale up in the Valley. And so, over the last 10 years, I think that that a lot has changed. San Francisco can access talent from the East Bay, South Bay, North Bay, and within the city. So it kind of, centralized a lot. But like, as a whole, in terms of tech hubs, I think it was Bill Gurley that said, like, in order to create a true tech hub, an ecosystem, you need at least 3 companies that are valued at 10 billion or more to have an exit. And the reason is for that is because it creates an ecosystem of new founders, of angel investors that like feed into that local ecosystem and create a true tech hub. And so, there's kind of a perfect storm with the, Stanford and Cal and all these universities. And then, this like high density of talent where, kind of, especially in leadership positions, are heavily concentrated in the Bay Area. That's less so, but like, it's also not a zero sum, right? Like, it's a really good thing that these other tech hubs are starting up around the country, around the world. It just gives the world more access to the technology industry. And it's also like really great for companies to be able to find talent and set up, offices or have, a certain percentage of their team, working from anywhere.
So one thing I want to add to what Kim I and Justin said is, I think really 2 points. The first one is I think the Bay Area as sort of the like by far most dominant tech cluster in the world. That era is recentish in the sense it's the last few decades. If you look back even to the mid 20th century, it was certainly not that dominant, and it gradually built up. And I think that era was already ending prior to COVID, just because it's gotten expensive enough here in the Bay Area because of limited residential real estate that it's capped to some extent, that at least in terms of the number of people, how people can move here. And so I think, COVID is not what ended that era of Bay Area dominance. We're already seeing places like Austin, Seattle becoming much, much more competitive. And presumably either those places are going to rise to the Bay Area's level of dominance over time, or we're just going to see more dispersion. But I think the Bay Area to some extent needs to get away from the mentality that it's going to be the only top dog in tech.
Yeah,
now, the other thing that
already
I think
reached its breaking point. To that point,
Yeah.
San Francisco already reached its breaking point. But before you go into this
course.
other point, I just want to remind everyone listening that we're going to have a good, I want to hear people's questions, and we're going to have a good amount of time for it. So drop your questions in the Q&A box when you can. Go on, Guy.
Yeah, I'll keep this one short because I was already talking for a while. So I mean, my parents immigrated with me and my brother when we were little kids, immigrated here in the late 80s. And, my dad was an engineer, so he was a tech worker in hardware at the time. I think there's no way that my parents would move here today because it's just so much more expensive. I think there is a real cost to residential real estate being as expensive. I mean, in many ways, I totally agree with Kim Mai. Like, this is a much more inclusive environment than it was, even in the 80s and 90s. But in terms of income, it's not. And I think when you look at our LinkedIn data, where people were moving out to from the Bay Area before, a lot of the people were moving to places like Arizona, Phoenix, Sacramento, that the main selling point is not these are other tech hubs. It's that these places are more affordable. And, I think probably a lot of these people are not high-end tech workers. They're middle-class workers that are very essential to the functioning of any metro area, whether it's teachers or restaurant workers, construction workers, firemen, policemen, policewomen. Like, I think that this bears a real cost to the Bay Area, and hopefully something that we can figure out, because rents, even if they're temporarily depressed, they're still high. If people come back, those rents are going to go right back up.
I'm Bill Gurley. He said, how many $10 billion companies
3.
did you say? 3.
Like through the analysis and kind of seeing trends, like, New York has been over the last kind of decade kind of building up, and they just reached that point, right? And so these tech hubs, like the true ecosystems, take a long time. Miami's getting a lot of hype, and it's like really exciting what's happening there. But all the people that are building that are planning over a 5 to 10 year horizon, right? And so to create these true hubs, it takes time and to build up these network effects. But it also makes them really hard to break once they get there.
That's interesting. We're all, obviously, everyone probably in this panel is living with the realities of remote work right now. What, in your eyes, to all the panelists, what gets lost in remote work, and how much does that affect productivity, what can get built, satisfaction? What really gets lost, and how great is the loss?
I mean, I
Kim,
think
I
it's
wanna-
really, yeah, I think it's like the delay time in really, I mean, in understanding where other team members are emotionally at. Like if you're in an office, you can see, you can just physically get so much more information about how they're doing, like as people, as human beings. That is really hard to get in periodic Zoom meetings, right? And then it's also just easier to like bounce ideas off of someone else and then agree to, you know, get consensus to move forward on something. And so like I do think that there is kind of, like a technical debt, so to speak, to like not being around around your colleagues in person for a long period of time. I think that that technical debt, quote unquote social debt, or whatever you want to call it, matters more for smaller companies than it does for larger companies. If you're in a larger company where you have processes and structures, and it's much more clear what the problem is, how the problem is defined, how to solve the problem, what everyone's role is in addressing whatever the problem is you're trying to solve, then you know you can have it be more of a structured environment where everything's documented and people know what they're doing. If you're a really, really early stage team where the problem set is not yet defined, you don't even know what the problem is, and you're just finding pre-product market fit, that like trust, relationship, you know, kind of your feeling about your colleagues matters so much more. So I do, yeah, I do think, like, I know that I personally am super excited to see my colleagues in person for the first time in a year. I'm like very, you know, I'm like, what are we going to do? What's going to be our icebreaker activity? And like, what kinds of like, you know, what kinds of team building exercises are we going to do in person? I know I'm feeling that excitement and hunger to get back there. I'm sure that other people are as well.
Yeah, I think we all, like, firstly have to acknowledge like how surprising it has been that companies have operated to the level that they have, you know, in the last year. No one would have predicted that, right? Like I would have absolutely predicted that like it would have been a lot harder to, you know, basically take every knowledge worker in the world and, you know, move them remote. And so, you know, over the last year, like, I think it's first important to acknowledge that like none of us have had a choice, right? And so we have had this kind of like forced remote experience where we've learned a lot about the, you know, what are the true benefits of it, and then also like what we're missing, right? You know, some companies are more productive, some companies are less productive, but on the whole, like productivity has at least like maintained to a certain degree that like is very surprising to us all. But I think that like the
productivity, kind of, but what about creativity? That's not the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's like a lot of elements to it, you know, like those kind of, you know, the serendipity of like, you know, jamming on a whiteboard or like walking by someone and catching up and then like, whoa, that's a good idea. Let's like bring more people in. But I think that like the other thing to really acknowledge is that like this is both a company-wide, you know, from company to company. Some companies are going to just, you know, kind of go snap right back to office centricity. Some companies are going to realize that they actually operate better remote, but it's also like a very personal thing, right? Like, you know, what we're going to find is that even though it's not going to be the majority of folks, like more people are going to find that like they thrive in the remote setting. And that's like really good for the world, right? Like if you can imagine knowing that at least some of your colleagues like would much rather be remote than be in the office, like, you know, it makes our work like much more inspiring because we actually get to like create spaces where they draw people in where like the default may be that they don't have to. And so I think that the benefits of the joy that you get from work, the energy that you get from people, the serendipity, like those are all things that are going to be really hard to, and maybe we never want to replace those. But, you know, for some individuals, like they're going to find that like, wow, I really, you know, thrive in this setting and are going to stick to that.
It's funny because just throwing from the model of journalism, which is not tech, I think the best ideas come from being out in the world with people. And I would call that some mix of intentionality and randomness. Like you got to make plans with people. And one thing I find in the pandemic is it's really limited everyone's social circle. So people are just making like the kinds of like the wide range of people I used to have conversations with prior to the pandemic. I'm personally having conversations with a much narrower range of people. But are my stories as good? Yeah, I actually think, and maybe it's because we were in a social crisis and journalists get motivated by those moments. And there's a lot of stories to tell, no shortage. but like, I would say, did my work suffer for it? No. But was I around those, was I missing those kind of ambient ideas that really fuel just thinking about the bigger picture? Where is the place going? I would say I'm starved for that. But that's journalism. I actually, think I haven't, let me be honest, I don't know how the best ideas come out of the technology industry. I've heard so many stories after covering this place for 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it is serendipity, and you never know when that moment is going to happen, or that like it can come about. I also think that we should acknowledge like the new people entering the workforce. Like, it is really hard to train and learn through osmosis when you're fully remote.
Yeah.
And I know that we're investing a lot into those younger team members, but it's really hard, right? Like, as opposed to just taking a whole lot of data and information in by being around the people that are mentoring you and training you. And that was a big part of the start of my career, was like learning through osmosis, and that is predominantly lost. So much of our interactions are very transactional, and it's kind of like a slotted amount of time to kind of figure out what you need to figure out, and then you move on. And so even we were about 20% remote pre-pandemic. But like even our remote team would come to our office once a quarter and like get those like in-person interactions. I think Kim Mai wrote early on that the offsite is the new onsite, or the onsite is the new offsite. And I think that's like predominantly true. Even for the kind of, my prediction is kind of like 15 to 20%. That's kind of growing 2 to 3x, like what we're remote to post pandemic. It's still going to be important to bring those folks together as well.
Okay, I want to make time to jump in for some questions that people have. Kim Mai, if you're burning to say something.
Oh yeah, no, I was
just
that if you pay attention to the remote work announcements, a lot of them are very specific, that like those opportunities are primarily available to like more senior individual contributors in many cases versus entry-level people. Entry-level talent still has to come in and do the process. And I think from a remote, I think if you interview lots of company founders, you'll find that like onboarding processes for new employees or entry-level employees, I mean, it is challenging in its own way to integrate like new people into a company, make sure they have access to everyone and feel included and supported in a remote environment. Yeah.
I also want to, sorry to cut you off. I also want to, I want to make time for Q&A. Also, I want to bring the conversation back to equity. Something that I've heard a lot is that when we go, I even heard that when I was reporting on Twitter, is when companies go back to this potentially hybrid model, then there's going to be this question of whether people who stay in the office get advantages and promotions, they get more face time, get advantages from people who leave than people who choose to stay more remote. And that equity piece is huge because it breaks down demographically. I'm a mother of a young child, and those are people who will want to spend more time remotely. Often people with parents of young children, and mothers are particularly disadvantaged by, I think, a culture where they would choose to be remote, but other people won't. Right now, the playing field's equal. We're all remote. But when we come back, it's not going to be equal. And I think if workplaces don't start really thinking about the equity questions and the fairness questions and how to evaluate people, I know Twitter told me that they're rethinking their performance reviews to try to account for the fact that, can you judge people fairly when their circumstances are so different? And I will ask that question, and then I'll say that there is someone, Will Smith, in the great name, in the Q&A, who said, he said, how do you see benefits and compensation packages differing intra-company when employees have such a great deal of choice when it comes to working remotely or in offices? So that's not quite about equity, because it's about how compensation is changing. But why don't I just throw both questions at you, and you can answer?
Yeah, I mean, to the answer to the compensation question, when we surveyed our early stage portfolio companies in the initialized portfolio, the data that we got back was that more than 60% of our founders said they would not make salary adjustments based on local market rates. And I think this is probably a function of like early stage companies versus later stage companies. I do think that later stage companies are probably more likely to make salary adjustments. I mean, they can obviously, if they're very mature companies that are profitable, publicly traded, they can obviously afford to pay more. Early stage companies, it's like a war for talent. And if you can get someone, remote, or, that like, their current employer is otherwise going to like basically give them a pay cut, like this is a way that you can get a leg up on that. And, we had some very, anonymous, but very interesting, colorful, responses from our founders, like, adjusting salaries downward, that's the stupidest, a bunch of swear words idea I've ever, a bunch of swear words heard. We will happily poach anyone who tries to pay cut their employees based on geos. And then, to your second question, yeah, the hybrid question is really, really hard. I think that, we don't know what the range of hybrid options are going to exist. I have definitely seen founders like intentionally say, like, we're not even gonna, hybrid is gonna just inherently introduce these biases between FaceTime employees and people who are remote. So we're just going to opt for a more remote structure in order to eliminate those biases. I've definitely seen that before. I will say though, like also as a mom of a young child who's like the same age as yours, I do feel, the like default setting of, of being allowed to be remote during this pandemic, except especially for moms with young children, there's certainly been advantages for it for me in that I get to be around my child a lot. And I do, appreciate that post-pandemic, the like default acceptance of being remote is going to be that much higher than it was pre-pandemic. And it's going to be much more socially acceptable for me to say that than it was, a year and a half ago. So like in certain ways, like there is a complex equity trade-off, but like, we've moved a long way from, Marissa Mayer's comments on remote work to what it's going to be after the pandemic.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think that just building off of what both of you have shared, I think childcare is actually going to be a major kind of perk, if you will, for workplaces, like to kind of, accommodate working moms and dads that like, don't necessarily have to be in their 9 to 5, but can like be a little bit more flexible with their schedules. But with the issue of hybrid, and equity, that like it's certainly a risk, right? There is a playbook for being 100% office centric. There is a playbook, although not as tried and true, but still it's there for being 100% remote. The hybrid workplace is the hardest to get right. And there are going to be like a few years of experimentation to find the right balance. Like, how are decisions made? How are teams organized? How does the company communicate? We launched our workplace as a service during the pandemic because we anticipated that like this is going to be the predominant way to build a workplace going forward, right? Like anywhere from smaller companies, but also like all the big tech companies are going to be either offering both remote and in-office positions, or like when you're attached to an office, connecting people. And so one thing that we think is going to happen is that teams are going to be organized based upon that, right? Like hybrid meetings are really hard. Like, if there's like 7 people in the room and 1 person dialing in, like that is not an equal experience, right? And so, the way that kind of companies have talked about it, like pre-pandemic, Stripe's 5th engineering hub was a remote engineering hub, right? And like, they're building and kind of creating offices all around the world, but like they organize their teams in a way that the teams are designed for how that they all want to work together.
I want to jump in and hear some other questions. Somebody asked, Michael Sealer asked, I'd love to hear the panelists' opinions about the short and long-term opportunity to utilize empty office buildings to become transformational housing for the homeless. What does this great reset mean for the city's homeless population?
So I think that, realistically, there's going to be a need to, take at least a little bit of time to see what office reuptake actually looks like in practice. The other piece that is important to, understand is that the fundamental architecture of office space and commercial office space is very different than residential in terms of like the width of the buildings, the space that you would have to like, I mean, there's just very large floor plates. And so if you were actually to convert it to residential housing, like a significant percentage of those units might be, like totally windowless units on the inside. And then you have to make some like design aesthetic, like questions around, is that what you want to offer people or what people want? So I certainly think it's a possibility. But I think that conversation is going to evolve over the next couple of years as you actually see, like, is this are people actually going to come back into commercial office space to the same extent that they were before, or is this really, really a change in kind?
Yeah, and from what we're seeing on the ground, like, I really do believe that these offices are going to fill up. We were at like 3%, less than 3% vacancy pre-pandemic. Like, a little bit of vacancy, a little bit of leeway for people to move around is like really, really important. And then also like the zonings are, there's just a lot of complexity that goes along with converting office space. But, my prediction is there's going to be enough demand and enough people returning that like it's going to be a non-issue.
So the answer is no, no change in housing status for the homeless in terms of the office buildings, but we go back to the conversation about rents getting lower. That could have some impact on the homeless.
I mean, I think that like more the conversation that is actually practically happening on the ground right now is advocates are asking the city to purchase existing privately owned hotels at a cost of $300,000 per unit, which is like, to be honest, like substantially less than, converting a whole office building or office floor plate to homeless housing. So that is the conversation on the ground now, which is like to be proactive on a counter-cyclical basis and to acquire, properties that are already effectively designed for residential living at near bottom of the cycle.
Yeah, it's going to be way too cost prohibitive. Just even, plumbing and things like that are, it just will not make financial sense. But, and probably not the best solution. There are, kind of better solutions to, help solve that problem.
But to defer slightly more generally on the question of commercial versus residential. I'm somebody who's pretty convinced that most people will be at least in the office part of the time when as the pandemic fades. If we're in a world where people are still spending on average, the amount of worker hours at home is higher than the amount of worker hours in the office, that does suggest that over time, and this may be a story that's actually more certainly years, maybe decades, that we gradually shift, like the residential building, or we increase the share of residential building stock in the Bay Area and reduce the commercial building stock. And I think like it's just hard to imagine, unless we just go back to exactly the same share of in-person hours than we were before, that there isn't some gradual shift, because that's where the ROI is going to be. If people are spending, less workers in the office, why do you need so much office space?
Well, you're also seeing in the housing, in the residential housing market, people wanting to buy homes with offices now for people who can afford it, or I mean, if you can afford it, but all the homes that are the hottest homes in the market are the ones that have these dedicated office spaces, because people really do need to work from home. So it would seem like that is kind of a shift from the office space, the commercial office space, and the square footage people are buying for offices at home. I see a question from, I'm totally going to butcher your name, BJ Yilmaz. I'm sorry if I butchered it. But they said, this person said, does anybody know the change in patent applications over the last year? Even though it is not the best metric, it is very relevant for measuring spatial innovation. And I read the question because I think it's true. We're all having this very abstract conversation about, was innovation affected during the pandemic? Any way to objectively measure it, like products that you all have seen launched, maybe Kim, maybe in the companies you've seen, like compared to previous years?
I don't know if like specifically for software, specifically for software companies, I mean, there's like a whole, online record and discourse about like the efficacy of patent applications with respect to software products, that I'm not sure that is irrelevant. It may be relevant for other fields, maybe hardware or medical devices or something else, but not not necessarily for software. It's primarily used as a defensive in a defensive sense. In terms of like the deal, and I mean, what everyone anecdotally says is like, this is, over the last year, everyone has said, this is the craziest deal environment I've ever seen, blah, 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 blah. I don't know if I have a way of quantifying that other than like deals or volume. I haven't looked at the recent data or NBCA of like, quarterly, amount of companies funded or,
the values of deals, that would be a better metric. Yeah.
It'd be a metric. I mean, it's also correlated, is that actual innovation or is it like, the choices of the Federal Reserve? It's the whole other conversation.
Right.
But yeah.
Is a Series A raise a better metric? Because at least that means the company has made enough progress to get there.
Yeah, sure. I don't know. I don't have the data on that off the top of my head.
It'd be interesting to know. What another attendee asked, and this is, we'll do a lightning round for this. What data point is the most influential for a rising tech hub? The number of venture capital the amount of venture capital invested, the number of companies moving their HQs there, or the number of new startups starting there? What's the best?
I feel pretty strongly that there's different metrics for a rising tech hub, but to determine if the tech hub is going to be lasting and kind of at the level of the Bay Area or even close to, it has to be determined by exits, of homegrown companies.
Yeah, publicly traded companies. I mean, the ingredients are if you have like established companies that can create, hubs of talent that can recirculate to new companies, and then also, like a very senior, experienced, former founder who is angel investing or seed incubating the whole ecosystem and is based there.
I mean, think about how many.
Actually, we're actually having to wrap up, but okay. I'll ask Guy. No problem. This is my job. But Gaia, do you have a really quick lightning answer?
Yeah, so I'm going to give an economist answer. Labor and capital. How many people work in the sector that are in that area? How much money is there? I mean, it's really basic, but like that measures the size in two important dimensions. And I think most of us, when we really think about it, which one place matter the most, those are probably variations thereof are going to drive our opinion of what the places are the biggest or more significant.
I could have asked you all a million more questions, but I'm getting the flashbang warning to wrap up. So thanks all. I really learned a lot.
This was awesome. Thank you so much.
You guys could talk for hours, I think. Liza, thank you so much for moderating this amazing conversation. Thank you, Justin, Guy, Kim, Mai, for always being amazing leaders in this space. We've had conversations about this for years now. Some of us going back working at SF City for a long time. So I think we're all bullish on what the future of tech looks like. It's going to be bright.
Totally.
After 2008, we saw some of the most exciting companies come. So we know this downturn is going to produce something fruitful. What it will look like, I think, is still to come, though. All right. You guys have any closing remarks that you'd like to leave us with?
Just very excited for 2021, bullish about San Francisco, and also bullish about tech ecosystems outside of San Francisco.
Totally. It's going to be the roaring
all
20.
around.
We couldn't be more excited. It's been night and day since the turn into 21, and I think that we are absolutely going to go through a renaissance in all of these tech hubs. And it's not a zero-sum game. Like, this is good for all ecosystems. That there's talent being spread, there's capital being invested.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a year where every single month is incrementally and meaningfully better, both for the Bay Area and across the country, and hopefully across the world. There's so many tailwinds right now. I just think we're all going to be much happier 12 months from now than we are right now.
And I'll say, right, I'll say cheers to that, and also that it does seem like there's something interesting to the fact that the rents have gone down and people have left, and maybe that makes that those kind of forces post-pandemic, at least for a time, make San Francisco a little bit more of a more evenly distributed economically type of place relative, but maybe it cuts off some of the worst edges of our socioeconomic problems.
I think that is a perfect point to leave off this conversation with. Thank you all for joining, and we will move on to our next segment. We will say goodbye to Justin, Guy, and Liza. And all right, we have Ant coming up on stage, and Anthemos Georgiadis.
Hi, Jennifer.
How did I do?
That was good. Georgiadis, perfect.
Okay, well, you're coming from Jennifer Stojkovic, so I know exactly how it goes. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. I mean, there's a lot we can cover in this conversation,
Yeah.
so I think everyone's just feverishly writing notes, taking down statistics. How are things been on your end?
So yeah, I run a company called Zumper, which is a large apartment rental platform. I think we've seen the pandemic told through our audience where, March, April, May last year, huge slowdown, everyone entrenched, kind of stuck in place, whether in San Francisco or elsewhere. And now you see this kind of huge mobility starting to occur, which is what your previous guests discussed. And this is going to be, I think the Zillow CEO calls it the great reshuffle. I think that's a fantastic expression from a competitor. We are about to undergo the great reshuffle of where people decide to spend the
Reshuffle.
next few years of their life, whether it's in a city, whether it's in the suburbs, because their companies allow them to go work from home. And we just put up, Zumper is having record traffic in March, which is usually kind of a slow seasonal month. So it's starting right now.
So you're at such an interesting point because you're both a CEO of a tech company, but you also are collecting a lot of real estate data. And so you've got a lot of viewpoints here. I'd love to start with your perspective as a CEO and what you're thinking about for growing your company. So you started in San Francisco, of course, much like most tech companies did. I'm curious, what was that choice to start in San Francisco, and what are your thoughts as you grow the company? Are you looking at things a little differently post-pandemic?
Yeah, so I as a British immigrant was kind of figuring out the US. I was drawn to San Francisco for two reasons that I think are still very true today, but slightly less true than they were a year ago. One was the talent that I wanted to build a tech company. I'd never done that before. The best technical talent, the CTOs, the data scientists, the machine learning experts a lot of them were in the Bay Area. Not the majority, but of any one area in the US, most of them were here. Secondly was the capital. So I was at business school on the East Coast when I raised the first $1 million for Zumper, and our VCs were here. And having never built a high growth technology startup before, I did really want to be near the capital, where not only did I want to learn from our VCs, I wanted to be close to the VCs that would do our next round and the round after. 8 years on, those things turned out to be true. And Zumper has, raised $150 million. We're kind of a Series D company. We employed 230 people. However, back to your second question, it's less true today than it was 8 years ago. And I think that's wonderful. So just like I think Justin mentioned on the previous call, if Austin and Miami, as two examples, take a bit of Silicon Valley's talent to build new hubs, that's amazing. And if I'm, the mayor of San Francisco and Mayor Breed, who I think is joining soon, maybe I don't think that's as amazing as I do if I take the macro view. But I think as Zumper thinks forward, we no longer need to attract talent just in the Bay Area. Our job is to position our company for where the talent is going. And I think if I think about your question in terms of where our next 200 hires going to come, probably the majority may be outside the Bay Area now. And I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially 8 years ago, and even still a little bit to this day, it was always known that if you want to start a company, you have to be near where the VCs are. And that's kind of been that way for several decades now. There wasn't really a choice, I think, up until very recently.
Yeah, correct. I mean, I think I would have been laughed at if I'd said, hey, I'm in Boston, I'm going to raise my seed round on Skype back in the day. I mean, no chance. I think it was a taboo, and people would think you didn't care enough if you were kind of raising digitally, whereas now a record amount of capital has been raised in the last four quarters, and it's all been done on Zoom with the odd kind of distanced coffee chats. Now, do I think that if the opportunity arises to spend time with a future investor, you're going to want to do that in person? 100%. Like, there are some things that Slack and Zoom can't solve. But to get to that point, do I need to be going down to Sand Hill Road? I mean, I live in Twin Peaks in San Francisco. Even I found it a pain in the ass to drive down to Sand Hill Road for every single meeting, even though it's only 35 minutes away. I would love a world in which people get to conviction over Zoom through the data, and then you kind of go hang out for dinner or walks to kind of get across the line. It's really hard to imagine a world in which a significant minority of deals aren't now done remote first. And again, I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think the venture capital community has got pretty comfortable getting to conviction on Zoom. And I'll add one other thing, which is I've heard a lot of VCs talk about the objectivity of getting to conviction on Zoom, that sometimes we have our prejudices and our biases, however implicit they are, when we're in person. And I've heard some people say they're making better decisions that are often kind of better for the portfolio by not allowing their biases to take control, which sometimes happens when you're in person and you resort to being comfortable.
Interesting. I'd love like a founder's perspective on the networking gap that's been so profound, particularly with getting access to the Valley. I mean, it's no secret that we have an issue of accessibility and diversity, I think, in the Valley. And I think that there's an interesting double-edged sword we're seeing with the virtual access to capital, right? On one hand, it opens it up to so many people, but I've heard from a lot of founders too, on the other hand, if you didn't already have those relationships, it's very hard to get that access in a virtual setting. I'm just curious if you've kind of seen anything like that playing out, especially as you're talking to some of the younger founders and how people are able to overcome those types of barriers.
Yeah, unfortunately, despite the comment I just made, which is like, it's in theory could make deals more objective and less biased towards like white men, I think the data shows the opposite so far, which is I saw some data that fewer female founders, I think the number was like 2 or 3% the last time I saw it, which is
2.5.
Yeah, shocking. That actually everything that, you know, good VCs have done better deals, but there's been a huge reversion to the mean as well, where actually fewer minorities and female founders are being funded. So actually your point stands that the access is real. And, you know, as you know, with VC intros, so often it's serendipity or serendipity with someone who knows one of them. But if you can't force serendipity through a pandemic, which I think is true both in Zumper's employee base, which is the thing we miss the most, which is serendipity at the lunch table of ideas, I think it's even more true with underrepresented founders. It's impossible to force serendipity by just going into someone's DMs or their inbox and saying, hey, look at me, like I'm worth talking to. Much harder to do that than to talk to them in an event where you get to kind of hang out at the bar afterwards or kind of over a coffee. And I think actually all of us have a responsibility to serve that post-pandemic, because there isn't a great digital way to foster serendipity. It's very difficult to create that out of the blue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the fact that we're having this conversation is that's the first point, right? I think that creating these new opportunities for access is a big opportunity that we're going to get out of the pandemic. But I'd love to take it to more of what Zumper's focusing on. So you guys are sitting on a ton of data. I mean, you're seeing this entire thing play out. You guys have a mountain of data that's really showing where people are moving and what those trends look like. What are you seeing right now, perhaps in this past year? How has it changed from the year before? And what are you guys forecasting the next year to look like?
Yeah, so we had about, so this is based on 70 million people who used Zumper last year and at 100 million people who will use us this year. So we see real-time analytics on what's going on. So I think the two things we saw last year are the kind of escape from cities, which every one of us is trying to figure out, is this a permanent thing or is this a shelter in place, go live with your parents and you're going to return? Time will tell. Rents are starting to tick back in New York. They're starting to tick back in certain other hubs. Interestingly, they're not yet in San Francisco. San Francisco is still on Zumper data down 24% on rent prices year on year. And I think it's down 28% on activity year on year. So these numbers correlate almost perfectly into like showing where the activity is. So first of all, for the Bay Area, I think my prediction is that a lot of people will return, but it's not going to be everyone. And I think, you know, at the peak of 2 years ago, San Francisco median one-bedroom rent was $3,700. And that was so unsustainably high. Now it's $2,650. And so we're almost $1,000 down on like the median rent for San Francisco. A lot of people will take that opportunity to come and experience Silicon Valley. And I polled my Twitter followers like a month ago, and most people thought San Francisco rents will come back to like $3,000 a month, meaning a lot of people will move back and pick the price up, but we won't get back to pre-pandemic levels in San Francisco for a while, because the remote work thing is real, as I think you heard in your previous panel. For the US, I think the most interesting observation we had is the concept of twin cities. That when we talk about people leaving San Francisco, leaving New York, leaving LA, the story that everyone's moving to Montana or moving to the mountains is not borne out by the data. What we see is this concept of pairing cities, that New York was down over 20% in its monthly rents, but everyone moved to Newark, where Newark rents were up 14, 15%. in San Francisco. San Francisco is down 24%. Areas of the central kind of California area, Sacramento, are up double-digit percentages as people moved within the states, not out of the states. And so I think this hysteria about the mass evacuation of California and New York is not at all borne out by Zumper data. What we saw is a kind of a move away from the dense, high-cost areas to higher quality of life, lower cost of living neighborhoods where also people could set up their workstation and have an extra bedroom as an office. So I think that the US story is much more kind of qualified by the fact that there's not a mass migration inland or anything, that people are just moving within their geos. However, post-pandemic, cities are back. Like, cities are going to come back. People are not going to evacuate. I think the big question is, a significant minority who don't return to cities may have a massive impact on the fiscal revenues of those cities. And so say even just 10% of people that left San Francisco don't return to San Francisco, which is very possible from what we can see in our data, still has a massive impact on the city's budget. And I think cities are taking that very seriously.
And when you say cities are taking that very seriously, what are you talking about? Policies? What are you seeing with both San Francisco and other cities for how they're going to address those types of changes in the economy?
So as an example of San Francisco, Mayor Breed was kind enough to give me some of her time a few weeks ago, and we spoke with her economic team, and I shared Zumper's data. I think, all of us are celebrating the fact that rents are down 25% in San Francisco because it allows a new generation of people access to this amazing ecosystem that we live in. The flip side is it's a proxy for how much lower economic activity is in San Francisco. And even though the federal government may step in to support San Francisco and cities that have deficits in the short term, if only half of those people return, so say of the 25% of people that have moved out, say 12.5% return and 12.5% don't, I think Mayor Breed and her team are very cognizant that if 12.5% of people do not return to San Francisco, that is has huge impact on San Francisco's budget and growth. And I think our cities are absolutely aware of that. But small percentage changes where to you and I may not feel that weird if 5 or 10% of Zumper's team stay with their parents or stay in a new geo and don't return to San Francisco. As a private company, we'll make that work. And it'll be really fun to make that work. But if you're a city and these are high earning, above median, income employees where you have income taxes for the state and you have employee taxes for the cities, they used to buy houses and you get real estate taxes from those things. Our data suggests that major metros have to take these these significant minorities very seriously because they may have a massive impact on New York and San Francisco, as well as a bunch of other cities.
Yeah, absolutely. In the city, each tech worker creates about 4.5 related jobs, right? So the economic impact it's very, very real. Are you seeing any interesting policies? Is there anything that's kind of caught your eye in terms of how cities are rethinking the future of their city and what tech and just office life in general is going to look like? Because we know that offices will look different on the other side of this. How different it's going to look, to what percent it's going to change, I think that's what's still really up in the air. And I'm just curious if you've seen anybody interesting in both the US or maybe outside the US that has maybe exciting or novel ideas around it.
Well, I think Mayor Breed knows that San Francisco, and I'll let her speak to this, but I think she's a phenomenal mayor, and I think she knows San Francisco needs to have its voice heard to attract kind of tech workers back post-pandemic. Mayor Suarez in Miami, to use an example, I met him a couple of weeks ago. What's phenomenal about the US, and I'm saying this as an immigrant from the UK who it's amazing to watch, is whereas it's not zero sum, there is a competition that is super healthy for talent within the US, and the US is so much better for it. So I think when you see what Austin, Miami, a bunch of other cities are doing to attract talent, there are subsidies to set up an office in Miami. If you get past a certain number of employees, you are economically incentivized to do that. I think a lot of the new cities who are going to compete with San Francisco, I think someone on Twitter put this quite well. They're the sales force right now. They have to sell entrepreneurs and tech workers to go there. So they're going absolutely above and beyond. Whereas San Francisco, someone characterized it online as more like customer success or account management, that people are here. We kind of have to serve them. But when you think about those two constituents, do you get sold harder by the people that want to attract you, or do you get sold harder by the people that already have you as a customer? More often than not, it's the former who really could have caught you because you're not yet a customer or a resident. And so I think, to use Mayor Suarez in Miami, who I met 2 weeks ago as an example, what they're doing there is phenomenal. And I think they've cracked the chicken and egg of like, how do you attract talent before the IPOs and before the venture capital funds have kind of all set up there? And an observation is it's not going to be bigger than Silicon Valley tomorrow, but they've started to solve the chicken and egg. And I think from the US perspective, that's wonderful that talent goes into this diaspora. In San Francisco, I think the leaders of our city are going to remind people kind of why they first moved here, and that many of those things are, for the most part, still true.
Are you considering yourself moving towards this hub and spoke model? This seems to be one of the big things that everybody's talking about is, and especially in the panel before, moving away from that HQ where everybody's all located in one spot, and rather a tech industry that lifts various cities all together. And I think that that's something that, certainly a lot of founders are talking about right now. With you talking about having different hubs throughout the country, I imagine that's got to be top of mind as you think about what the future of Zumper looks like.
Retention and attracting next level of talent guide our entire policy on this. Companies that do not move to more of a hub approach, where there's more flexibility of where people work from, Zumper is going to steal their talent, because the best talent now wants a more flexible work style. Now we have proven it works. And so for Zumper, HQ is in San Francisco. We are not changing that. Our headquarters are here. We're going to open an office in Miami. I just told Mayor Suarez about that. And if you think about my job as the CEO of a tech company, my job is to kind of be 2 or 3 years ahead of the trends to say, hey, is this Miami thing real? Or is this Austin thing real? Because if it is, yeah, it'll take a few quarters to actually kind of solve the chicken and egg and get it going. But come 2 years' time, if this is a major tech hub in the world, let alone the US, I want to build our office and our hub presence there right now, ahead of when it's going to be hot. So we build a presence and we add to the community. So by the time it's super hot, Zumper could have 150 people in our Miami hub. And so to answer your question specifically, pre-pandemic, we were mainly in San Francisco. Post-pandemic, we will absolutely still hire in San Francisco, but the vast majority of our hires are going to come in hubs, of which Miami is a new one.
Do you think there's going to be a lot of cross connection where you've got some of your, let's say your Floridian employees are coming over and spending time in your San Francisco office and vice versa? I'm curious how much you see those being siloed or how much you see them really kind of cross-pollinating together.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for like 1 or 2 events a year, we'll get everyone together. But for the most part, we'll invest heavily in the hubs in the States. So like our Miami hub, we would want it to create its own culture and its unique blend of what makes Zumper, our startup, like Zumper. I think what it does is more in the long term. I'm European. Like many of my employees have relatives on the East Coast or in Europe. Like when I talk about retention and attracting talent, actually we have an office in New York, and then we're soon going to have one in Miami. What an amazing way to be able to retain our best talent that says, hey, you used to live in Silicon Valley. You want to live near Paris, or you want to live near your relatives in Maine. You can work full-time in our New York hub or our Miami hub, and you can live your life while helping Zumper become a public company or do whatever's next in our destiny. And that is absolutely the mindset that I think most CEOs are going to have pre-pandemic. And to be honest, I had a pretty closed mindset pre-pandemic. I was a BCGer. I was used to working in my office 20 hours a day in New York and like being pretty much like at my desk 24/7. And I think the leap of faith that pandemics allowed me to have to grow as a CEO and to think about, I trust my talent. I don't need them to be in the office, and I don't need them to be just in the Bay Area. I trust them. If they want to work out of Miami or our New York hub, they're going to get their stuff done. And I fully believe in them. And let's empower them to go and build a culture in those offices. I think that's like such a motivating way to work in the future. And I think companies, unfortunately, that don't adopt that are going to hemorrhage talent.
That's really interesting. You pointed out the visiting family, because that seems to have been one of the trends that you mentioned earlier. So many people that have left these urban environments went back to their parents' houses. And I do think that some of the quality of life that people have picked up from the pandemic, of course, it's been a difficult time. There's, no doubt about that, but there is some benefits that a lot of people are going to want to keep with them. And that increased family time, I think that's definitely going to be at the top of the list, especially with a lot of the folks we've spoken to. I imagine your employees are saying the same.
100%. And I'll talk just selfishly. My wife and I have now 2 children, and my second kid was born 4 months ago. If you think about like partner equity at home, like back in the day when my first son was born, I went back to work after a few weeks, and like I was still coming home at like 8 p.m. We're 50-50. Like, Anna, I am better at my job as a CEO. I can work longer hours. They're just kind of funny hours, but because I'm on Zoom for a lot of the day. And I'm also a better dad. And I hope my wife may disagree with this, but I would hope to be a better husband because I'm able to do the things that always were getting done just when I was not here. And so talk about partner equity and like balancing of roles and relationships and empowering women to have it all. Well, this is an amazing way for men to help if you're able to live more flexibly and to be at home more. And I think we've all learned the lesson, which is a wonderful one, which is we don't need to be in an office all the time to be great at our jobs. We can provide and be there to support our families while doing good shit at work. And I think that's a key takeaway for me personally and for my employees is that I'm not saying you can have it all, but there's a better balance that could be had without jeopardizing anything in your career.
This is so inspiring. I've got to say, we've spent an hour and 20 minutes talking about this conversation. And, what began as a daunting conversation for a lot of folks is definitely becoming an optimistic conversation. And by the way, we have Mayor Suarez is popping on. We're going to bring him up in just one second. And what was what piece of wisdom would you like to leave folks with as we wrap this up, particularly founders maybe that are on unsure ground of how they're going to start their company, how they're going to, get to the spot where Zumper is now at today? What piece of advice would you like to give them?
Oh, wow. Tough question. I guess 2 things. One is go hug your parents when you're allowed to. I can't, my dad's 77. I haven't seen him in a year and a half. He hasn't met my son. I can't wait to give him a hug. So go hug your parents, everyone, because I can't wait to hug mine when it's safe and we're all vaccinated. On the entrepreneur one, the biggest lesson for me through the pandemic is bet on your culture. Your culture is more resilient than you possibly know. If you hire the right people and you give them the right incentives and you shelter them from kind of danger, cultures can get through this. Whether you're in the office, you're not in the office, you go through a global pandemic. If you hire the right people early in your company, they will be so resilient to get you through it. Bet on people. Don't ever worry about where someone went to college. Doesn't matter. Bet on the best people and they'll get you through it.
100%. As someone who has been separated by a border with my mom and dad for a year and a half, I am with you. Hug your parents, everybody. The vaccines are getting out there. Thank you so much for joining us. And this was a very inspiring conversation. I hope everybody is walking away from this with a really optimistic outlook for post-pandemic. We will let you get back to running Zumper. And with that being said, Mayor Adler, Mayor Suarez, with that brief little cameo, let's invite you up on the stage. All right, everybody. Hello, Mayor Suarez.
Hi, how are you?
Mayor Adler. Can you guys hear me all right?
Jennifer, I can hear you well.
We hear you well.
Fantastic.
Loud and clear.
How is everything going? Very, very busy day, I know, for you both. So I really appreciate you having the time to be here. How are things? We'll start with you, Mayor Suarez. How are things down in Miami right now?
They really couldn't be better. We've benefited from a tremendous migration of talent and capital from the Bay Area and also from the New York area, particularly in the last few months, where it seems like a tsunami of or tectonic shift of people who are looking at Miami as a place where you can do serious work and that can have a significant foothold in the knowledge-based economy, something that for me has been really a 10-year passion project, but kind of took a J-curve moment when I tweeted out, how can I help in response to Delian's tweet of what if we were to make Miami the new Silicon Valley? And so, for us, we want to keep things very simple. We want to be inviting to industry. We want to make sure that talented people feel that we want them here. We want to make sure that when they get here, that we don't take any more of their money than we need to to provide the social services that we think are going to keep our city strong, like quality of life, cultural services, homelessness, and crime. And that's it. I mean, that's our formula, and it's worked really well for us. And I think now we're evolving into a new era where people can work untethered to a physical location. There's a tremendous decentralization of talent, and that's benefited, frankly, Austin as well. Mayor Adler has done a great job of capturing a lot of that talent.
And Mayor Adler, I would love to know, how are things in Austin? I think Austin was definitely on the map a little bit sooner in these recent years than Miami, that's really emerging right now. But how are things going down there, and what have you been seeing in this last year in particular?
Well, things are going well right now because it's not freezing. We went through a pretty difficult couple weeks where an entire state lost power. But it's warming up. The vaccines are getting out to a greater number of people, and the artists and the making of art, which is such an important part of this city. That kind of entrepreneurial creativity is coming more outside now, and you can feel an economy and a city's engine restarting. And it's a great time right now to be in this city. Still a lot of challenges to overcome. Still, most people are not vaccinated, so still a ways to go. But we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Austin's been fortunate here over the last I don't know, 5 years or more. With a lot more exciting folks coming here, a lot more great ideas coming. But people self-selecting to live in a city that was already very creative and entrepreneurial. People that are choosing to be in a community that speaks to them for the same reason that it spoke to me almost 50 years ago, when, as someone who grew up in DC and went to college outside of New York, passing through town with no intention of staying, like so many other people in this town stayed. It was the art and the music and the breakfast tacos. It was an environment where it was okay to be different. This is a town that has always had a high tolerance for taking risks, which is why kind of the catchphrase is, keep Austin weird. That's what it's always meant. And I think that kind of feeling where taking risks, even failing, isn't punished, so long as you learn and come back, creates a city that's just made for innovation. So it's been an exciting year, even with the pandemic. It's pointed out a lot of the real significant challenges that this city has, with the disparate impact of the virus that we see, both in terms of a health and an economic basis. But during that period of time, new tech increased by almost 7% in the city. So we were one of the last cities to go into recession, one of the first cities to come out, and I'm hoping that we'll see that again here now.
So I know Mayor Adler, you were joining for a lot of the conversation earlier, and to get you up to speed, Mayor Suarez, we've been talking for the last hour and a half almost about what's the future of work going to look like. And certainly one of the things that we've all discovered is that when cities turn back on, they're all going to look a little bit different. And there's a lot of factors that are at play right now. We just spoke with the CEO of Zumper in particular, talking about, there's been some big shifts outside of urban areas, but there's going to be shifts back into urban areas, but also shifts to some of these newer cities. I'm curious, we'll start with you, Mayor Suarez. When you think about the future of work, what are the types of policies and thoughts that you are thinking about, kind of forward looking? You've been doing this for 10 years, so perhaps what you've done so far, and maybe for the next 5 to 10 years, how you're going to adapt Miami to that environment.
You have to start with the recognition and the understanding that whether we like it or not, it's a nonpartisan issue. Technology is going to dominate more and more the economy. That's just a fact. I mean, it's not something that's escapable. And so you have to build your economy around that. And so I think For us, obviously, some of the important macro metrics are important, like having a place where there's great taxation, a policy, having a place that's inviting and welcoming to innovators, inviting capital. And I think we've tried to just differentiate ourselves. And one of the things that we've tried to do is jump head into the crypto space. We want to be the most crypto forward state in the nation, and we want to be one of the most crypto friendly cities in the nation. So we've, our council recently passed a resolution that I advanced that allows for and will allow for our employees to get paid a percentage of their salaries in crypto, to actually pay fees and taxes in crypto, and even look at crypto potentially as an asset class that we can invest in. So those are the kinds of things that I think allow Miami to stand out in the sort of next generation of technology. We understand and we know that the innovation economy is here. It's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And you really have two choices. You can embrace it and try to differentiate yourself and expand that ecosystem in your city, or you can deny it. And you deny it, I think, at the potential peril of your residents' future success. I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. My 3-year-old already knows how to use my cell phone. We try to regulate that, of course, in our home. My 7-year-old probably knows how to use it better than I do. So it's just part of what life is going to be like. And I think cities need to understand that. We've invested in tech conferences. Obviously, Mayor Adler has probably the premier tech conference in the country. We want to get our tech conference to that level. We're focusing a lot on creating the right incentives to make sure that founders who are coming in this migration stay in Miami and feel that there's sufficient density. We want to concentrate on our education system. If we're really concerned about tech equity, then we need to make the educational playing field level. And we just unveiled a tremendous initiative that I'm super proud of yesterday, which was every single child on free and reduced lunch in all of Miami-Dade County to 100,000 children are now going to have free broadband for 2 years. That is an incredible asset to making our community more equitable, so that we're taking away the barriers that create a stratification in competition and don't allow our children to have the same opportunities to be successful in a modern day economy. So those are the things that we're doing. We're going to continue to talk about it because we often talk about it and we're very passionate. The mayor and I are very passionate about affordable housing. We're very passionate about transportation, and we should be, because those are important things. But if you think about it, that's about making things less expensive for people. We also got to focus on empowering people and giving them the opportunity to provide for their families and creating more high-paying jobs. And that's something that I think in government we don't talk about too much. We just kind of let the private sector do it on its own. But one of the things I've realized particularly in the last few months, is that the public sector has a role to play, particularly as a liaison and as a brand ambassador that will attract people to their locality.
That's a lot of amazing points. I've just got to go to the crypto. All right. Quick question. So are we talking, when you say allowing some of your staff to be paid in crypto, are we talking specifically Bitcoin, or you're really kind of going all in on everything, all crypto and the NFC?
Yeah, we're starting with Bitcoin.
Okay.
Because it's the one that's most well known, and I think we I have to be conscientious of the fact that my council is not all 43-year-olds, right? So some of my council members are very trusting on me, and they're saying like, we're taking a leap of faith based on all the stuff that you're doing, Mayor. We love it, but I can only push the envelope so far. So I think we're the first city in America to do it. I use the example oftentimes of the NFL player who mandated that 50% of his contract be paid in Bitcoin. And I think it was at 32,000 when he signed the contract. So he's not going to be the top 30 highest paid player in the NFL, but he's not the 30th best player in the NFL. So I think that's just one example of an employee exercising their right to be able to be paid in a particular way and it working out for them.
Yeah, and I imagine with the non-fungible tokens folks are talking about in the art scene, obviously, that's a huge part of Miami too. So That's really interesting.
Yep, it is. And the NFTs are, somebody asked me the other day if I wanted to NFT my tweet of how can I help? I said, sure. As long as we give the money to charity, I have absolutely no problem. We created a How Can I Help campaign. We've raised about $150,000 in a couple months, and we're donating all that money to iTech Prep, which is a inner city technical school that teaches inner city children coding, robotics, artificial intelligence, programming, etc.
That's amazing. All right, Mayor Adler, obviously we got a plug about, South by, which I think, is it going on still right now, or did we just, what's the date this year? You must be very busy.
Just started, so people should be signing on and watching some of the movies and listening to the music. So I think that some great speakers speaking today and over the next several days.
So we're lucky to have you. So what kinds of policies are you looking at? Perhaps not crypto with Austin, but what are the other kinds of really forward-looking future of work policies that you guys are pioneering down in Austin?
I think to a large degree, we're trying to keep the ground tilled and let the market identify the kinds of things that it needs, and then to be there to be able to support it. It's great to be on this program here with Mayor Suarez, a good friend, and Miami's a great city, and it's good to see him and be on this with him. Two cities that are obviously growing at this point and exciting places to be. And I've seen the work with the Bitcoin that the mayor's doing. I think that's great. I'm real excited that looking behind the Bitcoin and looking at the blockchain database, trying to, in our city, employ that to solve one of the challenges with homelessness, where people can't carry their records around with them, and you can't centralize the records without violating federal law in terms of privacy has become a real impediment. But by moving to a blockchain database with that information, then everyone who is in essence just walking around can walk into a room and immediately provide accessibility to anything about them that they would want to be able to share. But in our city, there's an entire ecosystem, I think, and then vertical that has been built out to support tech. A lot of what we're doing right now is trying to focus on middle skill tech jobs. Tesla moves into the city and needs a workforce that not only is at the higher end, but also a growing middle skill tech opening, and we want to be as competitive in that workforce as we are on the more highly trained and skilled tech folks that are coming out of the University of Texas Engineering School and out of the business school and the like. So a lot of focus there. Samsung also looking for another expansion in the satellites. A more broad kind of tech job future, but at the same time trying to build out the supportive structure that provides that highly trained base, trying to expand the levels of capital at greater risk levels and a greater strength than what we have had historically. That seems to now be moving to our city, and we're excited by that and the people that are coming. But more than anything else, I think companies come to Austin because the people that they want to have work for them want to live in the city. And I think that's the greatest attraction that we have. So it's being a very warm and friendly city, a city that really has internalized kind of all boats floating kind of thing. I talked to a lot of people that have arrived here from the Silicon Valley, and after they've been here for a year, I ask them how they like it and how they're doing, and most of them like it here and are happy that they're here. And when I ask them why, somewhere in the first three answers, I get something that comes back to me. Like when I first got to Austin, people were stepping over each other to try and help me, and people were opening up the Rolodex, and I was suspicious. because why would anyone actually do that? Even in a mildly competitive situation, people were doing that, and I was very suspect. Now it's a year later, there are new people arriving, and I'm opening up my Rolodex to them. That is the city, and so I think that making sure that the art is here and the music is here and the what is beautiful about being outside in this city is preserved and protected. We want to be a city that creates art, not a city that just consumes art. And that's an affordability issue, and why we're focused so much on those kinds of challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both very art-driven cities, both Miami and Austin. And I think that there's an overlap between cities that attract art and cities that attract entrepreneurs. Certainly, that's one of the strong suits of San Francisco and always has been, for hundreds of years now. To take it to a more specific question about the future of work, I'm curious, and we'll start with you, Mayor Suarez. We're hearing a lot of folks are moving away from an HQ model. So traditionally, the majority of tech companies followed the regular old way of building an office where you've got kind of that mothership. And certainly New York and San Francisco and places like that have a lot of those headquarters, but increasingly folks are going to a decentralized model or a hub and spoke model. I'd love to know what you're hearing from the folks that are building up these companies in Miami. And are you seeing more of those hubs emerging? I know Anth certainly mentioned that they're going to be doing a Zumper hub in addition to their San Francisco office.
Yeah, I do. I think the way forward is much more decentralized. I think there is going to be, and it's sort of saying the same thing a different way, less tethering to a physical location. I think COVID proved that, and I think that's one of the reasons why Miami sort of emerged so quickly. I mean, when somebody looks back and reflects on this sort of last few months in Miami, and they think to themselves, how could Miami have emerged so quickly? And be talked about with such a high volume in such a short period of time. The first answer to the question is, well, we've really been intentional about creating this ecosystem for a while, but then we kind of caught lightning in a bottle for a variety of macro factors. But I think you're absolutely right. I think the future of work, without a doubt, is precisely what we're doing right now. I mean, we would not have been able to do this. I mean, there's no way. I'm not even in Miami today. Mayor is in Austin. I'm actually in the capital of Florida, which is in Tallahassee. You're in San Francisco. It would not be possible to do this, and we're able to do this, stream this. Technology has just really removed boundaries, and so I think the collisions that are needed, the traditional HQ model, I think the analysis is, well, you need to collide, right? There needs to be collisions of intellect to push things forward, and I think you can collide very well on these virtual platforms. And I also think that the small hub model also works because you can also create more diversity. You can get more diversity of thought, more diversity of opinion, more diversity of geography, frankly. One of the things that I think is another reason why Miami will emerge strong out of this pandemic is our geography, our geolocation. We're kind of in the middle. When you put us on a map, you're kind of in the middle of everything. And we're close to South America, Central America, close to Europe. We have direct flights to the Middle East, and we soon will have, hopefully, direct flights to Asia. So we're basically connected by direct flights almost to the entire world, and that gives us a tremendous amount of connectivity as well. So I do think that the future of work has already changed. I don't think it's changing. I think it has already changed.
Yeah.
And the only question is, is there any kind of a scaling back as we come more and more out of the pandemic? I think there'll be some. But frankly, I find this to be very efficient. What I will say is this, and I was walking through the Capitol with someone, and he was telling me, we're actually in some ways, he was making the argument that in some ways we're a little bit less efficient. I think this is incredibly efficient. But where it can be a little less efficient is we have a tendency to schedule our life in 15-minute blocks or 30-minute blocks or hour blocks, depending on what it is. And so that's what you get to the Zoom, you do your 15 minutes, and then you move on. And he's like, what happened to the 2-minute blocks? What happened to the 5-minute blocks? You know what I mean? There's sometimes where you can get things done in 2 minutes and you move on, as opposed to doing a 15-minute call where you kind of feel obligated to stay on for 15 minutes because you budgeted 15 minutes oftentimes in the call. And then you can't schedule something right afterwards. So it's not like you can have 4 2-minute calls in a row, right? So I think that's something that, will ultimately resolve itself in the post-COVID world that we live in.
It's those Aaron Sorkins, those walk and talk conversations, and those are really what makes so many companies a buzz, right? The being able to walk over for 2 minutes and talk to someone at their desk. I mean, that's certainly something that I am missing myself. And I think, when we can come back to this world where we have both options, that's going to come back certainly. Mayor Adler, do you have any thoughts around this area and, hubs? I think Austin obviously has had hubs for quite some time. Do you see that growth as well?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the growth here started out with hubs, with companies that were in New York or Seattle, Silicon Valley, that opened up offices here. Small offices and big offices. I think we have the second largest Apple and Facebook offices outside of California. So something that we're used to seeing, and I think we're going to see more and more of that, just because it's easy to interact. But I also believe, like you said, that there's an element that helps with innovation and creativity, of being able to be with somebody in an unscheduled moment, when an idea is percolating, or not with anticipation of having something special happen, to then have it happen because of the interaction. And I think that also happens in cities, when you reach a critical mass of folks that are involved. That happens on the streets, and it happens in the bars, and it happens in multiple places. So I think you're going to see both. I think that there's still going to be a need for a lot of the structure that we had seen before. At the same time, it's incredibly efficient. I mean, in my post-pandemic life, I'm not sure I ever have a meeting earlier than 10 o'clock outside of my home, so that I can continue to just grab my jacket and throw it on, and then I'm ready for the meeting, regardless of what else I'm wearing. And I also don't think that I'm going to have very many meetings in person that are not socially focused, that happen after a certain time during the day. But I also know that we're social beings, and there's a really benefit of us being together. So I still think there's going to be a critical mass of in-person contact in order to keep things moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't know what it's going to look like on the other side. We've talked to so many leaders today, including both of yourselves, trying to predict what it's going to look like. And we know it'll be different, right? And trying to figure out the policies we can put in place as legislators, as VCs, as founders, like, how do we prepare for it now? I think that's the number one question, right? So in terms of preparation, this is where I'm going to pivot to, the big $1 million question. Certainly over in California, we have wildfires going on. And of course, there's that great quake that's going to be coming at some point. We're overdue for that as well, obviously being on the San Andreas Fault in San Francisco. And both of your cities also are in areas where there is some extreme weather. I think we didn't necessarily expect it out of Austin, but certainly Miami, having issues with seawall and hurricanes and things like that. I'm just curious how you see those types of issues and how you can mitigate those as you're growing these industries, and if there's any other cities that you're looking towards for policies like that. Mayor Suarez, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I gotta sign off after this question. Unfortunately, got another Zoom that I have to get on. But
of course,
we have a program called Miami Forever. We had a big hurricane in 1992 called Hurricane Andrew. And because of that, we changed our building code. So we started building the most wind resilient buildings on the planet. It was a 200-mile-an-hour hurricane, sustained winds. And we became the most wind resistant city on the planet. We then had a hurricane in 2017. So almost, 25 years later, if my math is correct, 25 years later, and which was Hurricane Irma. And there we had 2 to 6 feet of storm surge. So our next challenge was to become the most water resilient city on the planet, where we know we have storm surges from hurricanes, more intense than usual rainfalls, and what we call dry day flooding, where the water actually comes up from our poor subsoil and creates some pooling and ponding without rain. Those are engineering challenges that we don't run from, that we confront and take seriously. Our state, frankly, is working on a package of legislation, hopefully this legislative session, to leverage the $200 million that we bonded out as a resiliency bond. And we want to make sure that our city, again, becomes the most water resilient city on the planet, because we know that that has to be our brand. And we know that cities or people who are competitive with us, who might want to counter brand us, are going to say, no, you shouldn't go to Miami because, it's going to be underwater and stuff like that. So we take that very seriously. And then the beautiful thing about hurricanes, as opposed to some other natural phenomenon, even though there's not much that's beautiful about hurricanes, is that we usually get to see them coming. And as a city, we've been, we're pretty accustomed to them. And we get prepared. And so we're very prepared on, first responder front, on the infrastructure front, to make sure that we can weather the storms well and not suffer much damage.
You get that question a lot, don't you?
Yes. And I'll just finish by saying this: in life, if you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to tell it, and you're not going to like their version of it. So I have no problem getting asked a question. I have no problem answering the question, because I think people are often surprised by how prepared we are for the climatic phenomenon that we have to deal with.
Perfect sign off. Well, thank you, Mayor Suarez. We will catch up with you
Mayor.
again
Good to
soon.
see you, buddy.
Mayor Suarez, take care, man.
Yeah. All right. Now, I don't think anyone was expecting an ice storm and snow to be the disaster that Austin is facing, but that has got to have been on top of a pandemic. I can't imagine what it has been like over there dealing with such an unprecedented crisis. What has that meant for Austin, and how are you thinking about things going forward?
Well, that was quite the shock to us, and obviously there were a lot of people that were significantly hurt. Having a sustained period of time at 18 degrees below zero, unprecedented in the city. Obviously, there are a lot of things that need to change, and frankly, we're still in the tail end of the recovery phase, so we don't have all the answers that we need. But it's apparent that the energy grid that we had set up and the way that we regulated that industry didn't result in us necessarily or properly incentivizing hardening our system for the extreme weather situations. It also looks like there may have been some glitches with respect to pricing. So there might very well be some platform related issues that just need to be fixed. But you have these kind of crises, and you learn from them. When I came into office as a newly elected mayor a little over 6 years ago, not having been in government before, I came into office when we were having a historic drought. There were $1 billion proposals being circulated to tap into aquifers and to pipe water to Austin to fill back up Lake Travis. I was in office for a week before I made it rain and just filled up all of the lakes in the town. I'm not sure that I could pull off making it rain again if it happened. But the city put together a 100-year water plan for the city, and I'm not sure there's another major city that has one. So you take those challenges and you try to learn from them, and try obviously not to let that particular challenge come back and hurt you, but also to try and see what are the other kinds of challenges that have not happened yet, but could happen with that same possibility, and then harden against them. And I think that question of city resiliency not only addresses those one-off occurrences, but for cities across the country, as people know, in Silicon Valley and in Seattle right now, a lot of the resiliency is about people and about how you make systems, cities, municipalities work in a way that preserves diversity and makes sure that the artists that you like listening to in the live music clubs still can live in your city.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think on that note, I mean, at this point, we now have Miami, the most water resistant city in America, and we've got Austin, the most with the best water plant in America. So I think the contrasts are funny, but the future, of course, I think is going to be very bright for tech. I'm excited for for what's going to come post-pandemic. I imagine you are too. 2008 was when we got some of the best tech companies came out of some of these really, really difficult times. So the future is bright, and I will let you end with what wisdom would you like to leave all that are joining today, especially those that are in the tech industry that are trying to think through how they can be resilient and especially post-pandemic.
I think this is an absolutely exciting time. The rate of change is accelerating so much. When I look at the challenges that we face in our city, I know that so many of them are going to be answered with at the intersection of new tech innovation with those systemic challenges. I think we're in a period of time when the way that governments interface with business models is going to be changing. So many of the rules we're operating with now were put into place one or two industrial revolutions in the past. And I think that that's changing now. And it's just a really, really exciting time. And especially exciting in a place like Austin that has always put a premium on being early adopters and really open to new ways, open to disruption. And that's something that we see not only in business models, but in the operation of government. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you and to speak to this group. It's as we come out of the pandemic, the opportunity to come out so much stronger and more just and more equitable and more efficient and more successful is present, and it's exciting.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Mayor Adler. We will let you get back to what I'm sure is a very, very busy time for you. So I appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully this next one will be in person, of course. I think that there's going to be some cool opportunities to come for all of the cities to work together. So with that being said, thanks everybody for joining, and we will see you at our next event. Bye-bye.